Welcome to Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle. I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is a show all about music, music production, and the music business. My guest today is film and music producer Frank Fitzpatrick. But first of all, there's a battle that's raging between the IFPI and YouTube. The IFPI is the International Association of Record Labels, and every year they come out with a number of studies determining how much the industry made, where it was made, and what countries it was made in. So Google released a statement that its YouTube division, and of course Google owns YouTube, saying that it paid $1.8 billion last year to the music industry, and in total $6 billion since it began paying out royalties. The IFPI, on the other hand, says, wait a minute, that's way, way off. By our calculations, it's only $856 million. And they should know because they're polling the different record labels. Record labels have no reason to lie about this, because if it was more money, they'd be happy to say that there's more money being made. After all, they do want to be friends with YouTube, and YouTube really isn't making it easy. So as a result, what that comes out to is about $1 per user per year that accounts for the money that YouTube is paying out. On the other hand, there are 272 million paid subscribers to streaming services, and that accounts for about $20 per year. Just last year alone, it was $5.6 billion that was collected just from streaming services. The record labels call this the value gap, and it's a really big point of contention for everybody in the music business. The other thing about YouTube is they didn't really give any methodology as to how all of this was computed. So they say there's $1.8 billion that they paid out, but they don't say how it was collected, where it went to. So it could be just a figure that's pulled out of thin air. More than likely, it's a fudged figure. But one thing that we do know is that 47% of the time that people spend on YouTube, they spend listening to music. And 35% of those people say they won't subscribe to a streaming service because YouTube is free. So this turns out to be why the music business really doesn't like YouTube. There's a lot of people getting a lot of free music, and in the end, it's the record labels, it's the publishers, it's the songwriters, and the artists that are really taking a beating here. So let's hope that this changes sometime soon. It's better to get paid than not to get paid, but on the other hand, everybody wants their fair shake. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@BobbyOInnerCircle.com. Don't forget about my online courses on mixing, production, branding, and music business success at BobbyOwsinskiCourses.com. Also, get an expert analysis and objective opinion of your songs and mixes as a member of my Hitmakers Club. Go to hitmakersclub.com to learn more. Now, you may or may not know that there are restrictions on Rosewood. If you're a guitar player or a violinist or anybody that uses a stringed instrument that has used Rosewood in the past, you know that that's a problem right now because there's a 2017 international trade law that was passed in order to save Rosewood from illegal logging in tropical rainforests, mostly in Africa and Asia. Now, it turns out that most of this illegal logging was actually going to Chinese factories that were making luxury furniture, and not too much was being used by the music business. So it winds up that there's an import restriction on Rosewood and an export restriction on finished products that contain Rosewood as well, which means that guitar companies that have Rosewood fingerboards, for instance, they can't ship their product out to outside clients. Plus, they can't import it to use the Rosewood fingerboards that everybody so loves. Now, all this is a result of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES for short, and it's all part of wildlife smuggling. This is just a small part of all this. It protects 300 species of rosewood that's used in guitars and violins and xylophones and even bagpipes. Manufacturers have lost millions of dollars in all of this. However, the good news is Seitz just had a conference where they considered easing restrictions for instrument makers in particular. They found that using rosewood in musical instruments is not detrimental to rosewood forests, contrary to popular belief. So there's no resolution yet. That being said, the process has started to ease those rosewood regulations, which is good news for stringed instrument manufacturers and good news for musicians as well. My guest today is Frank Fitzpatrick, who's a multi-platinum selling record producer, Grammy-nominated songwriter, social entrepreneur, and award-winning filmmaker. Frank started in the business in concert promotion, but soon became a protege of hit producer Richard Perry. His eyes were always on music for film rather than hit songs, though. He's been quite successful at it, too, with major credits like Friday, The High School Musical, The Larry Sanders Show, Pirates of Silicon Valley, and the Scary Movie franchise, among others. Being socially aware and dedicated to optimizing the human potential, Frank has been a delegate to the Skoll World Forum on Social Entrepreneurship, a columnist for the Huffington Post, and has presented at and helped lead numerous international forums and workshops, including for Facebook, Mind Valley, TEDx, Esalen, the Vatican, Singularity University, Shanghai Academy, and many more. In the interview, we talked about working with the notoriously tough Richard Perry, the future of music for film, working on a video with the Pope and Dalai Lama, and much more. We spoke via Skype from his home in Los Angeles. I know all about your background, but some people who are listening probably don't. So take me back to the beginning where you started and got in the business.
So a little bit on my background. I grew up in Detroit, big music city, and was more of a music fan early on. It was the days of Motown and early rock and roll. And so I was exposed. I had 5 older brothers enjoying the world of music. So I was exposed from, 10, 11, 12 years old to all the top artists of Motown, from the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, to all the, and to all the early artists of R&B, from Aretha and et cetera, and then to all the early rock and roll that went through Detroit. Detroit was a big rock and roll hub for the U.S., so Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, everybody that was kind of doing the stadium rockers those days. I spent a bit of time on the streets at the age of 12 in Detroit when I was in the midst of a big collapse, and music was what I always called my lifeline. It's like if I didn't have music, I don't think I'd be alive today. So I always really appreciated the value of music beyond something more than entertainment, and decided pretty young I wanted to do something with music that could help people and give them, inspiration and motivation and something to take them through the best of times and the worst of times.
You're there in Detroit, and obviously it's a big music town, and every musician I know that grew up in Detroit has deep, deep roots. But it's a long road from Detroit to Los Angeles. So how'd you get there?
Yeah, it is. Well, I decided, like I said, pretty early I wanted to do something in music. So I ended up going to college, putting myself through school at the University of Michigan, and music was the path I wanted to take. It was one of the top music schools in the country at the time, but I also knew I wanted to make a living at it, so I got a degree in business and a degree in music, and I was promoting concerts and doing radio shows and playing in bands and getting degrees in 2 schools, a little bit of an type A personality. And I, at the time, I knew I was either going to kind of follow in the footsteps of making records kind of, in the lines of Quincy Jones, or go to, that would be West Coast, and New York would be East Coast, and kind of go in the lines of George Wein and promote concerts, And I, in addition to all the stuff I was kind of already doing within the throes of the business, producing shows from people like Miles Davis to, lots of jazz and alternative jazz, to Ray Charles, to early Prince, to I did some work for some favors for the Pointer Sisters, who were being produced by the time by another Michigan alumni, Richard Perry, big producer at the time. He was probably the top pop producer at the time, if Quincy was a top R&B producer. And I went out to LA during my senior year. I went to New York to look at jobs with George Wein and Company. I went out to LA to look at jobs, and Richard decided to move me out to LA as soon as I graduated. So that was my entree to LA. I packed up my car and drove across the country. It is far. Yeah. And thought I'd stay for a year, and here I am, 30-something years later.
Richard Perry is a pretty good person to learn from, that's for sure. And especially at the time, he was hot.
Yeah, he was hot. We were doing the Pointer Sisters Breakout LP, which was their launch back into stardom, and kind of crazy stuff like the Julio Iglesias, Willie Nelson duets, and Diana Ross, Willie Nelson duets, that kind of... So it was quite a change for me, because I came from the world of, Miles Davis, Ornette Coleman, Weather Report. Maybe as pop as I was going at that time was Ray Charles. Prince, who wasn't that pop, but to the early '80s and the pop R&B crossover of pure radio. So it was quite a transition. And I used to say, when I was working at Studio 55, Planet Records, what they would do in Hollywood is go back to Philly and Chicago and Memphis and Detroit, get all the great musicians, bring them out to LA, put them into a microwave, and put them on vinyl.
Let me ask you a Richard Perry question. Ken Scott told me a story about Richard, and I just want to see if you saw this. They were doing a Harry Nilsson album, and Richard apparently really liked to work musicians hard. It was nothing to do 80, 90, 100 takes, because he felt like after they got tired, then they get good again, and then they would really get it. But apparently, where some people have perfect pitch, he had a memory for takes, and he would sit there and say, okay, take the intro from take number 35 and the first verse from take number 18, and go on and on. And Ken said one day they thought they would see if this is really the case. So they took one from take number 55 instead of take number 54. And Richard caught it right away. He said, no, that's the wrong one.
Right.
Did you ever experience something like that with him?
Well, a couple of those pieces. One is, I think the first session I sat in on with them, they were cutting something for the Pointers. And it was, in those days, all the demos were live. He would record everything in a couple of different keys, and he would record it in a couple of different tempos before he made it. So he was really, in terms of the 100 takes, he was very particular. And then, but the first session I sat in on, it wasn't so easy back then to do that, because it was all 20, 48 tracks of tape with him. So in the first session I sat in on, it was a 4-hour bongo session overdub.
Okay.
Yeah, nonstop, take after take after take. So, wow. Now, he made some great records, and everybody has their own approach, but it was just very different than what I was used to, So
especially jazz.
That's something that Clive Davis was ever able to get of Bob Dylan. I should say that.
Okay, how did you make the transition then from working with Richard to becoming a producer yourself?
Well, I think it was a bit of a little different road than that, because I didn't go, I was trying to write and trying to produce and trying to learn about producing. But what I had a shift that was a little different than that, because I went out with the intention of becoming a record producer, and I kind of studied and developed my skills that way, from the musicianship to just the ears and the knowing and kind of following music and knowing different artists. But for me, the shift was actually towards film, because like I told you the story when I was 12 and I really wanted to do something with music. That was also, the early 80s were kind of the heyday of what we were calling the San Francisco directors at the time, but the Francis Ford Coppola, Oliver Stone, and I grew up on a lot of music, but I didn't grow up paying a lot of attention to film. And suddenly I found myself in a theater. I think Oliver Stone had just released the 4th of July, and I was watching, and I realized, hearing George Delarue's soundtrack score to the movie, how powerful the combination of music and image was. So for me, it was more of a shift of, yeah, I loved making records and I loved making music, but if I wanted to have impact on people and reach more people, that I could have a lot more powerful impact by combining the two mediums. So I made I continue to try to develop my chops as a, budding songwriter and a little bit of producing but I dove into pretty early on into the world of film music and started learning as a music editor and started working on shows and got into the union that way and would write and produce songs in my spare time and work with artists and all the meanwhile working on to learn the language of film and to develop that, So I moved into that pretty quickly just because I really believed I could have a lot more impact by knowing both mediums.
What was your first break in that particular avenue that you were taking?
Well, it's hard to say what's a break. Everything's
Yeah.
Overnight successes are kind of a as they're not kind of a misnomer. But I think because I was a little unique in that world because I had this really strong record and music background from the song side. So as I developed as a music editor, this was kind of in the very early days when there wasn't very many music supervisors. They were kind of an anomaly. There was only a couple of them at the time, Joel Sill and a couple of other people who were doing it at the time. And so when I started working closely with the studios and working on films and getting kind of deeper in the trenches and working with some of the bigger composers like George Delarue and stuff, I kind of had access to both worlds. So it allowed me to do two things. It allowed me to really help directors shape those soundtracks a lot more. Allowed me to write some of my own music to slip into some of them. And eventually, I think my first break on doing my own soundtrack came out of that work. I was, kind of become the music editor by default, music supervisor, and, support system for the composer, working with everything from the orchestras to the studios. And I think it was Nuns on the Run. It was, the money, with Eric Idle and Robbie Coltrane, a British film that Fox had just picked up as a negative pickup when it was right around the time when A Fish Called Wanda came out. They were looking for another film like that to break through, and this was a great rompist British comedy with the executive producer was actually George Harrison.
Handmade films, right?
Handmade films, yeah. So Fox got their hands on the film, and we started testing it with audiences as we do everything. Just test the crap out of stuff until the audience ratings go up before you decide what's going to be the final film. And it had a very British look and a very British score, and it made it look to the American audience kind of like this 1970s TV, late night TV movie, So I proceeded to, replace the score with a temp score, which and another friend of mine, an associate who was working under Joe Roth at Fox at the time, recut the first part of the film, and between what I did with the music. And instead of just pulling in, existing tracks for a temp score, I actually wrote and produced one. So in 3 days or 4 days or something, and we raised the audience ratings by 300%.
Whoa! So
that gave me an open gate to, and a good relationship with the director to say, hey, can I take a shot at this? I got an idea what to do and how to make this kind of work in the U.S. audience, and that's how it broke through.
Wow, that's a great story. And you know why? Because everybody has their own story about how they kind of broke in, but that's kind of unique in a way because you took the initiative on something where no one expected you or maybe even wanted you to.
Right.
And made it work. Okay. You went from there to what? You have some great credits between High School Musical and Larry Sanders and Scary Movie and all those. When did you feel like, okay, I think I got this now. I know how to do this.
There's two sides of that, because part of it is, as soon as you think you got it, you don't.
Yeah.
The more you think you know, the less you know, and the more you learn, the more there is to know. So, I think as in music, if anybody's pursuing anything in music, I mean, you can even reach, we're going to honor Wayne Shorter at his 85th birthday at the Kennedy Center Awards this year. And he's a perpetual learner, so is Herbie Hancock, who's at that, in 80 now. And they never stop kind of trying to learn. And, so in terms of that, I don't think that, I felt pretty good. I remember standing, the campus at Pepperdine up on the top of that hill, looking out at the ocean over Malibu. Well, I grew up a kid in Detroit, and it was, it was a mess. Standing there after my, I don't remember if it was after my first film or after I did Friday, which was a big early hit. And I just going, just for me, just really grateful and just couldn't imagine that I could actually be standing in this place and creating music for a living. Just those were inconceivable concepts when I grew up. They weren't part of the palette.
Yeah.
No matter how you look at somebody's credits, over 30 years, 35 years, 30 years or whatever, there's always spotlights that make it seem like they had a continual success, but it's not. It's like there's, you crash, the business was a really competitive business. So you make a bit of money, you spend it all trying to stay in the game, replacing equipment, going on again, getting, and then you got to build yourself back up. You're only as good as you were the last, your last credit in the last 6 months. That's the, the game. So but what I have had is the opportunity to work with some amazingly talented people from, on the comedy side, from people like Gary Shandling to Ivan Reitman to Jonathan Lynn, to many, many, many people, and on the dramatic film side, from Francis Ford Coppola to, many. So I've had a chance to learn from and work with a lot of people on the film side, and then on the creative side, to write and produce with a lot of great artists, from, Jill Scott to Anthony Hamilton to so to me, it's, I don't know that there's a breakthrough. There is one thing there is a point you kind of realize you got it, when you're surrounded by a team of people and you know exactly what to do with the project. You're sitting around and you can help this director, you can help this studio, you can bring together a team and guide them in a way that's going to deliver a really successful product. What I found with myself, because I had to make a decision at some point, I was working as an editor for who I mentioned before, George Delarue. And George Delarue was one of the great film composers of our time. He was the French Ennio Morricone. So, he's did many, many famous films like Platoon and Beaches, Her Alibi, all the Francis Truffaut films, some 250 films before he passed away. And so at that time, the big composers, if I was looking at film composing, were, John Williams, Jerry Goldsmith, George, Ennio, and I was looking at, and I was thinking, I don't, even though I'm classically trained, I don't have those kind of chops. I have this ability this really great pop sensibility and record sensibility and, popular music sensibility, combined with this in-depth understanding of how the cathartic experience of storytelling works in a film that I learned from the masters like that. So I had decided to marry those together and try to make the contemporary soundtrack. So I had all these gigs that were insane because I would be the music supervisor and the composer and the songwriter and producer on a couple of the singles or tracks, and putting that all together. And but I think the skill set that I had was just that way to really understand where each of those elements did their best service in storytelling and organically fit into the process, and how they fit that dramatic arc that lasts 90 minutes and delivers this cathartic experience to the audience,
Right.
And so that learning kind of mastering that is something, I don't know if I've ever mastered the creation of great music, but that kind of relationship to the human psyche, between music and between storytelling is something that I think I have a pretty strong grasp on.
We passed some emails back and forth before we did this, and you mentioned the future of the soundtrack. Obviously, you've thought about this a lot, but I've never heard of anybody else thinking about it. For the most part, people, they do it, they look back at history, but I don't hear of too many people talking about the future and how it might be different. So what do you foresee?
Well, it's here. You're going to have some mega original soundtracks on the big films, as you're seeing now with Star is Born, and we have a few along the way, and then you see obviously the new Queen movie will be Bohemian Rhapsody will be one, but that'll be all pre-existing songs. So,
yeah.
But for the big studios, when you get these movies that are budgeted over $100 million, you're $5 million into the music, For an independent filmmaker, and for the average film, the soundtrack market is very soft. Compilation records are hard to make. They don't exist well in the marketplace, just for a number of reasons, because people can get the individual tracks now, and because of the multiple platforms. And if you have something that was pre-existing, it's going to exist somewhere else besides your record.
Yeah.
So, and people are not buying CDs as much, and as you know, and even the download world is starting to go away. So where do we end up? Well, we end up with the streaming world, which is good and challenging in another way. But one opportunity that it provides for filmmakers, and I can give you an example because I'm releasing an independent film now, where I'm taking advantage of this. So maybe I'll just talk about it through the example.
Yeah, please. I was going to ask you about it next anyway.
Okay, so the film is a romantic comedy called Love Jacked, and the director, he wanted to have kind of a timeless soundtrack. So he has a real affinity to classical song, R&B songs. So we have tracks from, the Temptations, Stevie Wonder, and up to Bruno Mars, which isn't, such an old classic, but, Dionne Warwick and more, that he wanted to have throughout the film. So here I am, I go and I wrote and produced the singles, and I was the, executive music producer and wrote the themes for the score and kind of did it, was the head of music because there's no studio with the head of music. And one of the executive producers on the film, but here I am shorthanded because I don't have, I got a couple of singles I want to leverage. I don't have a soundtrack, meaning in the old days, I wouldn't have a soundtrack. Because in the old days, you have these great big songs that you put in the film, but you don't have soundtrack rights. So you're not going to get the soundtrack rights to that Stevie Wonder song or that Temptation song or that Earth, Wind, and Fire song. Even if you had the money to pay for them, it wouldn't do you any good because people could get the songs everywhere else, so they wouldn't buy them off your soundtrack anyways.
Yeah,
so you're just a promotional tool for everybody else. And then I have these like 3 original songs that are just sitting out there by themselves, and because it's an independent film, I don't have major artists on them. I don't have a Jennifer Hudson or somebody on the single that's going to drive it. So with streaming, now suddenly I have this chance where, okay, I can build a soundtrack. I can offer it on, this particular one is on the 4 major streaming platforms, the biggest platforms. And I can offer it as a playlist. And I don't have to own the rights to those songs to put on the soundtrack. And I can give that soundtrack away fundamentally for free, all the fans of the film, as a promotional tool for the film and as a giveaway, kind of to carry the life of the film forward in the minds of the viewers, like a soundtrack would. It doesn't become a big income play like you would with a traditional old record, like, with like the Friday soundtrack where it earned more money than the movie.
Yeah.
But it does come in terms of somebody being able to have a great soundtrack. So we have this great, sort of big chill-ish soundtrack, with all these classic R&B hits and major artists. And then I could implant into that or embed into that 3 singles with newer, kind of lesser known artists, and offered on all the major platforms as the soundtrack. Suddenly we have a soundtrack.
Just as a playlist, you're saying?
Yeah, but that soundtrack albums are going to be.
Yeah.
The playlist, right? So, I mean, a few people will download, but another year or two, 90% of them will be listening to them on prepaid services.
Yeah.
So it creates this opportunity, and it's funny. I was doing it, and we were getting ready to. We were, doing a premiere on the film, and then Spotify just ran an article, or somebody ran an article about Spotify in the Wall Street Journal, saying Spotify is coming up now with the new invention of the soundtrack, the playlist soundtrack, and releasing the first film to ever do a playlist soundtrack. Coming in, I don't know when it's forthcoming, but it's but it's just a complete game shift, because you're able to do that because those rights are already owned and respectively paid on the back end from the DSPs, the providers,
Sure.
to the artist. So you're not having to go and own and license those rights,
Yes, but you can't make any money from it either, though. That's the downside.
Yeah, well, the truth is, if you were to pay for those rights, you wouldn't make any money off it anyways.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can make, I make money off. So, I mean, you don't make any money off the playlist, but you do make money off of whatever you have on that playlist. So right now, the opportunity for the singles game is to be on the most popular playlist. That's it. Like, you have a good R&B track, you want to be on Spotify's hits of R&B playlists. That's the only way you're going to get enough play to get enough streaming income to make it worth it, right?
Yeah.
So in this way, I can take these unknown, lesser known songs. If I can get popularity among the playlists of the soundtrack, then all the songs on that gain popularity. So it allows you to put new songs, new artists into and surround them by major artists in a way that you can help them gain popularity and get popularity to those singles.
It's guilt by association.
Those new things that I own 100%, but it's how, it's how.
Okay, that's cool. I don't ever remember anybody talking about that, but it makes perfect sense, because what other way is there?
Well, there's still the old game. You can still, studios still release records. Most of them release them anyways, but it's usually because they license and own the sounds and put them on that right. And then one of their most of their income most of it's already paid for by them because they own the content, and then they get residual back end income off of whatever streaming dollars come in, as small as they might be. It's just adds to the pot for them.
CDs are still around, and it's still almost $1 billion business in the United States alone. I just wrote an article on our Music 3.0 blog the other day, and it was about the fact that, believe it or not, there's still a big demand, especially for the hits. If you happen to have a hit album, or you're a hot artist and you're coming out with something, the CDs are so hot that they can't keep them in stock. Retailers can't actually keep them in stock. And there were 4 artists that over the last month that couldn't get stock to go day and date, or they sold out immediately and everything went on back order. Who would have thought?
Right.
Now, in the grand scheme of things, there's only, we're only talking about 100,000 CDs, but that's still real money. That's a whole lot more than you make on a lot of streams.
It's a lot better money than you'll ever make on streaming, as is downloads.
Yeah.
So downloads are still here. Both those games are much more expensive to play, because if you don't see a lot of you'll see that among the top sellers.
Yeah.
I don't know. You could probably say what percentage of that $1 billion is top selling artists, but it's probably 80% at least, right?
Yeah, I would say.
So that makes sense, because you've got so much invested into them that you can play that game, because the stocking game of inventory, all the returns cost at this point, and where you have to be accept, to be in the CD game, which are many less distributors, physical distributors. So that exists. But for, there's kind of this gap in between the indie artist who's selling CDs full price at their gig, which I recommend that anybody do. So,
yeah, right.
Because it's a great way to make money, and then the big artists. So if you're in this range of selling, 25,000 records, 50,000 records on an expensive record, where you've had to hire producers and engineers and multiple artists, and you got a lot of people to pay. That's a tough game because it's a tougher space for that.
Yeah, yeah. Before I let you go, I want to talk a little bit about beyond entertainment, the power of music, because you're quite an activist. That's always been a big part of your life, making the world a better place, especially through music. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, couple of things. I mean, somebody asked me several years ago, I made this transition into calling myself more of a social entrepreneur than an entertainer,
Yeah.
About a dozen years ago. And I was a little burned out on Hollywood, and I started looking at why I got into the music and film game, and realized that it was to have positive impact on the world, and just decided to kind of take a step back and see how I could make sure I was shaping what I was doing to do specifically that. And, somebody around that time was asking me, don't you get excited to waking up in the morning knowing you get to write music or work on a film or do the, and I go, no, what actually gets me really excited now is knowing the potential of what we can do in the world with those tools and doing that. Because, music is, I don't want to be cliche and but it is just one of the most powerful transformative tools that we have on the planet that's totally underused in the areas where it can be most powerful, like it's beyond entertainment. So I'm part of the faculty of Singularity University Exponential Medicine Conference, and I speak about music and health, and have kind of done a lot of deep studies into that, how music can transform and does transform health, and the potential of what we can do, everything from cancer to Alzheimer's, dementia to child development. And then I've hosted and facilitated a lot of think tanks around the world of bringing music and media into education and how it affects the learning process and eventual success of the child in their later life. So I'm just impassioned by that, and just, it was never my intention to go out and be. John McHugh interviewed me for one of his shows once, and he called me the music minister. So it was never my intention to become the music minister, But I just, as I was actually doing my work as a social entrepreneur, and seeing what people like Gates and Jeff Skoll and people were doing in the world, and then what was happening in music education, just music was so out of the mix, and there was such a limited scope on, that music is either a commodity or source of entertainment, and beyond that, it's just a charity model. And I just, I'm committed to shift that perception and to bring it into the places that we need it most, and whatever that takes. And I've speak around the world about it, from TED Talks to, different platforms. And I've done a lot, I'm just finishing up a book, the process of that on to get out on it. And, have developed pilot programs and tools for curriculums for at-risk kids and technologies to deploy it across, the learning about it across, large scale systems. And so it's I know you're committed to it too. A lot of us are. And it's still amazes. It never ceases to amaze me two things: how much we can do with the power of music to help people, one, and two, how much there is in a gap of that understanding in the general populace and the people who would typically fund those areas of need,
Yeah, I agree. And I know you're trying very hard to bridge that gap.
Like it takes all of us. It's not me. I'm just a catalyst, I'm just a spark in the fire. So I'm just trying to.
Okay, Frank, last question for you. You've been an entrepreneur for a long time, so this is perfect for you. What's the best piece of business advice that either somebody imparted to you or maybe you learned yourself along the way?
Well, generally, I would say find a way to make money and then and keep doing the things you love too. but I think that it's really important. I stopped looking at music as a standalone commodity probably 15 years ago. I mean, because the continued devaluation of it as a standalone commodity is going to continue towards zero for the major part. There will always be money made in it. So the key is really to look at music within the context of something that it makes stronger, So whether it's for film, whether it's for a campaign, whether it's to build your brand, if you're an artist, you have to kind of think of yourself not just by the music you write, but it's the music that creates the image of who you are.
Yeah.
So just really music as like the secret sauce that you put into whatever you're making, and not the main ingredient.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we do a real disservice by focusing on the traditional ways of the music business. All we keep doing is coming up with new platforms and new technologies to sell music in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Entertainment. So if you were, if I was to advise Larry Page or one of the guys that, heads of Google on where they should go with music instead of Google Play, I would say go specifically into music. And, the next level of the music industry will be healthcare.
Yeah.
Because it's valued at a whole different level. So there's another thing about, like when you say you've made it, and I think to me, I don't look at goals of making it so much as like once I've got my Grammy, once I've got my, once I have a hit record, it's really about levels of mastery. So, finding something in the craft that you, or the use of the craft that you can master. And when you feel that you've been able to apply that mastery in a way that's effective. So I'll give you an example. I did a project about a year and a half ago for Pope Francis and the Dalai Lama and some of the spiritual leaders gathered together as part of the end slavery campaign to stop human trafficking and slavery. So the goal was to create something. It was a collaboration with one of the world leading humanitarian photographers, Lisa Christine, who's that movie Sold was made about. I don't know if you ever saw it.
Yeah.
And so the goal is, how could you take, if you had 3 minutes and you had a room of all the world leaders who are about, and these are world leaders that are very strategic thinkers, not creative thinkers, judges, prosecutors, lawyers, political figures that are trying to solve this huge, horrendous problem of human trafficking and slavery in a room together, and you had 3 minutes with them. What could you do with music and image that could make a difference? So that's where the subtle levels of kind of mastery is. How do you really learn to get inside of the psyche of the listener and the viewer in a way that transforms either their heart space, their thinking, their consciousness, so that anything that takes place in the moments thereafter comes from a completely different place. And so that's where I love the space in which, I love to play and feel like we can make a huge difference. So, I did that. So, I created a piece for them that they, that Pope Francis opened the session at the Vatican for, and the open Parliament at the House of Lords. And I've done the same thing with big film openings in China, and kind of broken a lot of barriers. Just, how, taking those skill sets that we've learned to hit 80 million kids when they turn on the TV and make them, jump up and down, dance and smile, to get into the psyche and physiology of people, so they shift their beliefs in a positive way without them even knowing it's happening.
It's deep, Frank, in a good way.
When we can do that, I know I've done something.
You can find out more about Frank at frankfitzpatrick.com, frankfitzpatrick, all one word, .com. Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@BobbyOwnerCircle.com. To listen to other episodes of Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle, go to BobbyOwsinski.com and select the podcast tab, or go to BobbyOwnerCircle.com, or you can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Mixcloud, Google Play, Google Podcasts, and now on Spotify. At BobbyOwsinski.com and BobbyOwnerCircle.com, you'll also find a sign-up form for my newsletter and for alerts for new podcasts. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time.